Good morning. Happy Tuesday. I have Neuro Coffee in hand and it is perfect. I'm in a great mood. I got to talk to somebody yesterday that I haven't talked to in what seems like forever. Picked up right where we left off. It was a great conversation, so I'm thrilled. You know who you are. I was thrilled to see you, and I'm looking forward to the next call. We are going to make sure that we follow up. So if you've got a friend that you haven't talked to in a while that you miss and you just haven't talked to him, go ahead and give him a call. Man, that was fun. Anyway, let's dig into Tuesday's Q&A. We got to get rolling here. This one comes from Brian, and Brian says, would one always want to try to bias more mid, forefoot, and big toe loading versus outer heel loading during the entire range of motion during a split squat if the goal is to promote improved hip and pelvic external rotation? And then he follows up with a second, would we always want to use an ipsilateral load as well to achieve the same goal? So Brian, this is a really good question because we're going to be talking about biases, which you know that I'm a big fan of. But let's go through some of the foot mechanics stuff just as a quickie review, and then we'll kind of show why we probably want to come up with a little bit different strategy than what you're offering. Okay, so if we look at the foot. Okay, and remember we got our three rockers as is commonly described. So we've got a heel rocker, and that gets us from ground contact to this early position. We've got ankle rocker, which takes us from this E-yard position to I-yard position, so the arch comes down. And then we've got our late propulsive strategy, which is the toe rocker, which brings us back to this E-yard position. Okay, so we go ER, IR, ER, as is commonly found in almost every motion that we talk about. Now, so what you brought up was cueing lateral heel contact throughout the split squat, and I understand where you're going with this, but there's a couple things that we have to understand about these foot mechanics as we come into this early propulsive strategy. So we've got tibial ER, we've got traditionally a supinated foot, so we've got ER through the system. We've got first and fifth met heads down, and we've got a calcaneus on the ground in this early position. One of the things we want to understand is that the deep posterior compartment of the calf, so the Tom, Dick, and Harry. So we got tibialis posterior, we've got flexor hallucis longus, and then we've got flexor digitorum longus posteriorly comes down around the medial ankle. So that muscle, that group of muscles is going to be concentrically oriented, but it's also going to be using an overcoming strategy at heel contact, but then this becomes a yielding strategy as the foot comes down to the ground. The reason that we want a yielding strategy is because we want to distribute load through the tissue. So we have to create a yielding strategy so we have energy storage for the energy release. And so the yielding strategy is going to be through the bone, through the connective tissues, and through the musculature itself, where the connective tissues lie. And if we don't have that, then something's going to have to sort of take up the slack. So if I cue lateral heel throughout, what I'm going to do is I'm going to promote a strategy that maintains a concentric overcoming action throughout the excursion of the exercise. And maybe there's a circumstance that you might want that, but under most circumstances we don't want that. So here's where that shows up in the real world. When you get your runner that comes in with a posterior tibial stress syndrome or shin splints or whatever you want to call it, they're typically using a concentric overcoming strategy as they run, and so the bone then becomes the only source where we're getting any significant yielding strategy, and so that's why you get tibial stress. This is what the end game is, your tibial stress fractures. And so what we want to do is we want to teach people to distribute those loads for energy storage and release in a much more efficient manner. So Brian, what I would do is I would take your little heel wedge or something like that, and I would be working the front foot in this heels elevated position, because what this does, it's going to bias us towards that early propulsive strategy without altering the foot mechanics, and so we can still get our concentric yielding strategy. We're just biasing ourselves back towards that external rotation element of the full propulsive excursion. So now let's move to the pelvis. Let's talk about the pelvis orientation, because we can create that bias as well. And so I'm going to hold the pelvis in this orientation so you can kind of see this. So real quick. So remember, early phase ER bias, middle phase, IR bias. So when we're talking about a split squat, we're moving through rather ER to IR and then back to ER. And if we're talking about the lead foot. So what we can do though is we can bias this lead foot towards more external rotation, more internal rotation. We're going to go ER to IR under every circumstance, but again, we can create a little bit of a bias. And so what I can do is I can position the ilium and the sacrum in a little bit more of a bias. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create this yielding strategy at the base of the sacrum here, and I'm going to be ERing this ilium. And so what this would look like would be to project the knee forward in the split squat. So before I even lower myself into the split squat, I'm going to create a stronger bias towards ER, and then as I descend, I'm going to get less IR as I go down through that middle range excursion towards what we would consider 90 degrees of hip flexion. So right away I get to bias it. If I wanted to do the opposite, what I would do is I would shift backwards and I would create a little bit more of a bias towards internal rotation, and then as I go down into that excursion, I get more internal rotation as I approach 90 degrees of hip flexion. So this is just your typical hip shifting kind of a bias that you would be using. But the cool thing about this is the load position now that you mentioned is also an influence. So what I can do is I can take the contralateral loading and I can bias it towards internal rotation. So I create those same hip mechanics that I just showed you to bias towards internal rotation to lower myself into the split squat. If I use the ipsilateral load, I create the hip bias towards external rotation. Now here's the question mark. It's like, what are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to improve my ability to maintain external rotation? So under those circumstances, I create the hip mechanics that are biased towards external rotation, and I use the ipsilateral load. It makes it easier to acquire those range of motion mechanics. However, at some point in time, what I may want to do is challenge that and actually produce force into external rotation. Under those circumstances, I'll bias it towards the internal rotation mechanics, so I have to push myself up and out of those internal rotation mechanics to create more external rotation. So Brian, this is a great question, very, very useful. Just keep in mind that all we're doing is creating biases. Internal and external rotation are superimposed. And so again, it's like how we start is going to influence how we move through that middle excursion and then how we end. Thanks again, Brian, for the question. If you have any more questions, go to askbillhartman@gmail.com, askbillhartman@gmail.com, and I will see you guys tomorrow.